Hi everyone, Professor King here. In this video, I'm going to be talking about John Burnett's article, The Bath Riots, Indignity Along the Mexican Border. I'm sorry, Ken Burnett, not John Burnett. Ken Burnett's The Bath Riots, Indignity Along the Mexican Border, the link to which you can find under this week's module on Canvas. This also ties into the discussion of Kimberly Crenshaw's notion of intersectionality that we're also covering this week. So I want to make sure that you have that read, and you should look at that web teach first before you move on to this one. Crenshaw can be a little theoretical and challenging, a little dense in her language for this level of a course. So it's a good idea to know what she's saying within the context of what we're going to talk about here. So if you haven't watched that yet, go ahead and watch that. But anyway, without further ado, I'll take it to a share screen. Before I do, always know that whenever questions come up, feel free to contact me via email, Canvas messaging, whatever works best for you, as long as it works for me. And it's not a comment on YouTube or Pronto. So with that being said, let's go to the share screen and I will pull up my PowerPoint. Ooh, here we go. Let me just do my slideshow thing. Okay, so this is an article that came out a little over a decade ago, and it's actually in reference to a book that was published that I'll talk about at the end of this PowerPoint presentation. For those of you who are interested in this historical information, want to do a little more research, especially as we start to prepare for reading Native Country of the Heart by Cherry Moraga. This might be something you want to learn more about. All right, and this is actually a picture right here in this heading of the migrant workers, the migrant domestic workers who were sprayed with things like Zyklon B, which is what they used in a larger quantity to kill Jews in the Holocaust. They were also sprayed with DDT, which caused a number of health issues, including death, for people who experienced the Vietnam War, for example. So just really dangerous, contaminating chemicals that they were spraying on naked individuals during this time in the early 20th century on the American-Mexican border. So anyway, before we get to talking about the article itself, I do want to review Crenshaw very quickly. Remember that when we're talking about intersectionality, we're thinking about how people are often disadvantaged by multiple sources of oppression. As I mentioned in the video on Crenshaw, intersectionality doesn't always deal with oppression. It deals with multiple identity markers. So those can be positive, negative, neutral, or any other adjective you want to place on them. However, when we talk about intersectionality, and particularly in Crenshaw's discussion of intersectionality, we're looking at the ways in which those multiple identity markers may come into play in acts or instances of oppression, and how those, when a person experiences a multiplicity of those, how that can then affect or maybe even make exponential the oppression that they experience. And I've listed some of the ones there. Again, I talked about them in the previous video: race, class, gender identity, sexual orientation, ability status, immigration status, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And intersectionality itself, it's a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects, right? So it's not simply that there's a race problem here or a gender problem here and a class or LGBTQ problem there. Many times that framework erases what happens to people who are subject to all of those things. And that's a direct quote from, again, the person who coined the term intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw, and that was an interview she did with Columbia Law in 2017. Even though she wrote about intersectionality in the late 80s and early 90s, you know, this is sort of her life's body of work, among other things. And so she's still talking about it into the relative present. All right, so now let's take these ideas of intersectionality that I briefly touched on here and I touch on in greater depth in the video that I posted for this week. And let's think about this article. There's a quote from this article, probably about a quarter of the way through. I want you to think about what is said here and consider it from an intersectional lens. So in Burnett's article, at one point it is said, the Mexican housekeepers who revolted had good cause to be upset. Inside a brick disinfectant building under the bridge, health personnel had been secretly photographing women in the nude and posting the snapshots in a local cantina. A year earlier, a group of prisoners in the El Paso jail died in a fire while being deloused with gasoline. Gasoline, in addition to DDT and Zyklon B, being something that they use to delouse people coming over the border from Juarez into El Paso, right? So you have all of this going on. And you think about what a blemish, right? And I'm not going to say on an otherwise pristine record of American history, because that would be a lie. But you think about the ugliness of that, you know, instituting this act, which, you know, in the article itself, it says was not necessary, that there was no, you know, that Mayor Lee's fixation with typhus was not founded in reality. And so putting these people through this day in and day out to come work menial labor jobs in the United States was, to put it euphemistically, adding insult to injury. So let's think about this. And now let's ask ourselves certain questions, because as we read, right, Carmelita Torres is the person who instigated these bath riots, a woman, a 17-year-old woman from Mexico. And so thinking about her place within this situation, this historical event, I want to ask some questions now. So first off, thinking about intersectionality and thinking about what you read in this article, I want you to ask yourselves the following. How might the women's experience, not just in the bath riots, but again, crossing that bridge every day and having to be deloused and being not only made naked, but sprayed with these incredibly harmful chemicals to go work a job where they clearly probably were making livable wages. How might that have been different if we altered some of these identity markers that we talk about? So think about first their gender. Well, we have some indication of what happened to men from that previous quote, but think about the photos in the cantina, for example. How might that situation have been different had these workers been male? How might the experience have been different had their ethnicity been white, or at least passing as white? What if they were born on the American side of the border instead of Juarez, Chihuahua, wherever they were from? How might this situation have been different had they been of a different socioeconomic status? For example, being wealthier than the life that they were born into. And what about the setting? You know, if we think about Texas in 1917 versus, I don't know, here in 2022, how might the time and place of these events have affected them? So when we think about those, and think about them in combination, right? Maybe think about, what if they were white but not wealthy? What if they were white and male but not wealthy? What if they were white and male and wealthy? What if they were white and female and wealthy? And think about all of the different possibilities for this scenario changing had we changed the identity markers of these people, right? Of some of the people involved. And so when you start to think about that, it hopefully makes you consider the impact of understanding an intersectional approach, of understanding that it's not enough to make these categories what's called essentialist, meaning they're sort of these separate monoliths, right? But in seeing that so often for so many people, they are connected, they are intersecting, they are conflating, they're complicated, right? And so every interaction that we have, every rhetorical situation that we have, because these riots are a perfect example of a rhetorical situation. If we're talking about an author and a text or message, an audience and a purpose, all of that is there, right? But if we change some of these elements when we talk about intersectionality, then we are changing the very situation itself. And so that's why some of this stuff is really fascinating to think about when we think about it in terms of writing and rhetoric and all of that stuff, because it has major implications. So take a moment to think about that, and then I'll move on to the next slide. So now going beyond these women, or keeping them kind of centered, but going to other players within this report, other details, other items. Let's sort of expand our focus for the moment. So we have other women, right? Not just Carmelita Torres, but other women, and they were all called Amazons, which I think is, like whenever there's an act of refusal on the part of someone born female or living life as a woman, there's this almost knee-jerk tendency to I don't know, take away their humanity by either making them seem crazy or foolish or too masculine or whatever, right? Whatever those descriptors mean. But beyond those women, we have Mayor Lee and that unnecessarily imposed quarantine on these workers. We have General Francisco Murguia, right, with the so-called death squad, who interacted with these resistors, right? We have the public health officials and the motormen involved. And I think these people are particularly fascinating because they're from both sides of the border. It's not that sort of, fifth grade, like, this is the big bad person and these are always going to be the innocent victims. It's a system, right? It's a system in which so many different players and variables are operating to create the event that takes place. And then think about the bridge itself. If you want to talk about, if we're going to talk about English and literature and symbolism and metaphor, a bridge is such a well-known symbol or metaphor for connecting. But if we think about the antonym of connection, which is division, right? Dividing, we can definitely see how this bridge serves as a very fascinating metaphor for what is going on in this situation. Is it connecting these two worlds? Is it showing a division? Is it showing a liminal space in which we're kind of in between these two nations or worlds? So think about those things and just mentally riff on them for a few minutes and think about what your thoughts on all of them are. And then I'll go to the next slide. And then if you're interested, I've put some further reading here. On the far right, that ringside seat to a revolution, that's actually where a larger extended version of this story comes from. And David Romo is interviewed in this news article, this sort of historical news article. And so if you want to get more information about the Bath Riots or other acts of resistance on the El Paso Wars border, that might be an interesting place to start. Another one is, and this is one that I'm working backwards visually, by the way, here. Another one that I think is really interesting because it speaks directly to our campus is Gustavo Arellano's Orange County. Particularly, he has a chapter in there on the Citrus War of 1936, and you can kind of see these parallels of oppression and resistance taking place, particularly in communities where intersectionality where intersectionality plays a role. And then the last one, it's a little more tangential, a little less directly related, but I think this notion of quarantining and of noxious chemicals, of connections to the Holocaust, these are all indicative of a larger issue going on. So one you may want to check out is Benjamin Medley's An American Genocide, the United States and the California Indian Catastrophe. Again, we can make those sort of parallels between the texts that may be of interest to you in your research. So that is about it. Thank you for paying attention and listening and all the things you do. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and week. We'll see y'all in cyberspace. Goodbye.